4,000 years. That is the vast, unforgiving expanse of time that separates a single, desperate decision made in a windswept desert tent from the explosive conflict that dominates the skies of the modern world. When the night sky over the Middle East illuminates with the fiery trails of missiles crossing the distance between Israel and Iran, the world watches in terror, believing they are witnessing a modern geopolitical crisis. But they are not. They are witnessing the latest bloody chapter of a rivalry that did not begin in diplomatic chambers, nor in the strategic war rooms of generals. It began with one old man. It began with two women who could never divide the same roof. It began with a family. If you have never heard the full, unvarnished story of what happened in those ancient days, the secret genesis of the world's most intractable war, stay with us. Like this video so more people can discover the ancient stories that secretly govern our modern history. Subscribe so you never miss a chapter. And now, let the story begin. The story opens in Ur of the Chaldeans, a sprawling, prosperous metropolis rising from the fertile plains of what is now southern Iraq. It was a world of towering ziggurats and polytheistic devotion, a place of commerce, stone, and absolute certainty. Here lived a man named Abram. His name had not yet been changed by the divine. He was married to Sarai, a woman of deep, quiet strength, and together they held a stable social position. They had wealth, they had servants, they had livestock. They had absolutely no rational earthly reason to abandon everything they knew. But then, the voice came. The ancient text records the divine call with an abrupt, world-shattering directness. The creator of the universe spoke to this aging man and commanded him to leave his land, to turn his back on his kindred, and to forsake his father's house. He was to walk into the unforgiving wilderness toward a land that would only be revealed as he moved. There were no maps provided. There were no geographical coordinates. There was only a promise. And what a promise it was. The Almighty declared that he would forge from Abram a great and mighty nation, that he would bless those who blessed him and curse those who cursed him. Through this single obscure man, all the families of the earth would find their blessing. It was a covenant of staggering proportions, a guarantee of universal historical relevance, divine protection, and an uncountable lineage. Yet beneath the weight of this cosmic promise, there lay a devastating, silent tragedy. Sarai was barren. The ancient record does not hide this fact. It emphasizes it with clinical precision before the journey even begins. The biological reality was undeniable. The promise of a vast, world-shattering nation had been placed upon the shoulders of an elderly man whose wife simply could not conceive. Abram was already 75 years old when the dust of Haran settled behind him. He gathered his aging wife, his nephew Lot, the wealth they had accumulated, and the souls attached to their household, and they stepped out into the void, walking toward the land of Canaan. When they reached the great oak of Moreh, near Shechem, the divine voice broke the silence once more, refining the covenant. Unto Abram's seed, this specific land would be given. In response, the old man built an altar of unhewn stone. It was the first of many. Each altar he constructed across the dusty landscape marked a visceral encounter with a god who demanded the impossible. But time is a cruel master. The years began to slip away like sand through an hourglass. 5 years passed, then 10. The twilight of their lives was deepening into a somber, melancholic dusk. Abram and Sarai continued to age, their bodies growing frailer, their tent remaining completely devoid of the sound of a child. The magnificent promise hung suspended in the desert air, beautiful but seemingly unattainable. And then came the night that would alter the trajectory of human history. The Creator led the aging patriarch out from the shadows of his tent and commanded him to look up into the deep velvet blackness of the Middle Eastern sky. "Count the stars," the voice challenged, "if you are even capable of numbering them." so shall your descendants be. In that profound, silent darkness, standing beneath the blazing canopy of the cosmos, the old man believed. He anchored his soul to the impossible, and the heavens accounted it to him as absolute righteousness. But faith in the night sky does not change the harsh light of morning. Sarai was still barren. Consider the agonizing tension of existing in that space. You possess a divine guarantee of an uncountable lineage. You have staked your entire existence, your wealth, and your remaining years on this word. And yet, every single month, the biological reality of your wife's body confirms that the cradle remains empty. The agonizing distance between the prophecy and the present reality stretched until it felt as though it would snap. Abram was now 85. Sarai was 75. Every physical law screamed that their time had run out. It was within this crucible of silent, suffocating despair that Sarai made a decision that reverberates into the modern era. She approached her husband with a proposal born not of malice, but of pragmatic desperation. She acknowledged without bitterness that the Lord had restrained her from bearing children. She did not curse the heavens, but she sought a human solution to a divine delay. She offered her Egyptian handmaid, a young woman named Hagar. "Take her," Sarai urged, "so that a child might be born upon my knees." In the ancient Near East, this was a culturally acceptable, legally binding arrangement. The Code of Hammurabi, etched into black basalt centuries prior, strictly regulated such surrogate practices. The child of the handmaid would legally belong to the barren wife. The text does not record Abram seeking divine counsel. It merely states that he listened to the voice of his wife. After a decade of waiting in the dust of Canaan, the patriarch accepted a desperate human shortcut for a problem God had promised to solve. Sarai took Hagar, the Egyptian, and gave her to Abram. A single, fleeting action, a transaction of flesh that would ultimately fracture the world. Hagar conceived almost immediately, and in the wake of that biological triumph, the first poisonous seeds of a millennial hatred took root. When the young servant realized her womb held the heir to the great patriarch, the dynamic of the camp violently shifted. She began to look upon her elderly, barren mistress with unconcealed contempt. The young woman carrying the future could no longer mask her disdain for the woman trapped in the past. Sarai, humiliated by the very arrangement she had orchestrated, unleashed her fury upon Abram. She blamed him for the indignity she now suffered. Abram, retreating into passivity, handed the pregnant girl back to his wife's absolute authority. And Sarai dealt with Hagar with a severity so harsh, so deeply oppressive, that the pregnant Egyptian fled into the unforgiving wilderness. A pregnant woman, alone, navigating the brutal, scorching desert of Shur toward Egypt. It was a virtual death sentence. But she was not abandoned. By a desolate spring of water, the angel of the Lord found her. Hagar became the first person in recorded scripture to receive a personal visitation from the divine messenger. A runaway, discarded Egyptian slave. The angel commanded her to return and submit to her mistress, but he anchored this brutal command to a staggering promise. He declared that he would multiply her descendants so immensely that they could not be numbered. She was to name the child in her womb Ishmael, for God had heard her affliction. Look closely at the magnitude of what is happening. The Almighty was offering this marginalized servant a promise mirroring the one given to Abram. Two massive, uncountable peoples would spring from the same root. But the angel's prophecy regarding the unborn boy carried a dark, eternal weight. He shall be a wild man, his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. The child's destiny was etched in stone before he drew his first breath, a legacy of perpetual tension and relentless conflict. Hagar returned. She gave birth to Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old. Finally, the tent echoed with the cries of a son. For 13 long, formative years, Ishmael was the sole heir, the apple of the patriarch's eye. He grew tall, learning the ways of the desert, assuming the mantle of the firstborn. Then, when Abram was 99, the divine silence broke once more. The covenant was formalized. Abram became Abraham, the father of multitudes. Sarai became Sarah, the princess. And the impossible decree was handed down. Sarah, at the age of 90, would bear a son. His name would be Isaac, and the eternal covenant would run exclusively through his bloodline. Abraham fell on his face and laughed in sheer, overwhelmed disbelief. Then, with the desperate love of a father, he pleaded for the teenage boy he had raised. "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." God heard the father's cry. He promised to bless Ishmael, to make him fruitful, to multiply him exceedingly into 12 princes and a great nation. But the specific, eternal covenant, the divine lineage, would belong to Isaac. The blessing was shared, the covenant was strictly exclusive. When Abraham was 100 years old, the impossible breath of Isaac filled the tent. The child of the promise had arrived. The bitter laughter of disbelief transformed into the ringing laughter of joyous celebration. But as Isaac grew and was weaned, the suppressed tension between the two mothers erupted into open hostility. During the great feast of weaning, Sarah saw teenage Ishmael mocking, or playing with, the toddler Isaac. The exact nature of the interaction is shrouded in ancient ambiguity, but Sarah's reaction was absolute and terrifying. "Cast out this bondwoman and her son," she demanded. The son of the slave would not share the inheritance with the son of the promise. It was a demand of breathtaking cruelty. Abraham was shattered. This was his boy, his companion of 17 years. But the Almighty intervened, commanding Abraham to listen to his wife, for the lineage of the covenant lay with Isaac alone. Yet God reiterated his protection over Ishmael. The next morning, before the sun could cast its harsh light over the camp, an elderly, heartbroken father rose. He placed a skin of water and a measure of bread upon Hagar's shoulders. He handed over his teenage son, and he sent them away into the desolate wasteland of Beersheba. There were no prolonged farewells, just the brutal finality of expulsion. When the water ran dry in the baking heat, Hagar placed her dying son beneath a withered shrub and walked away, unable to watch the boy perish. She sat in the dust and wept until she had no tears left. But heaven heard the boy's raspy cries. The angel called from the sky, opening Hagar's eyes to a hidden well of water. Ishmael survived. He grew strong in the wilderness of Paran, becoming a master of the bow. His mother took a wife for him from Egypt. Far from the tents of his father, far from the brother who had eclipsed him, Ishmael forged a nation born of exile. His descendants became the nomadic warriors and merchants of the Arabian deserts, tribes that would eventually intertwine to form the vast Arab peoples. Islamic tradition, rising millennia later, proudly traces its lineage directly back to this wild archer of the desert. Meanwhile, Isaac's line forged the history of Israel. From Isaac came Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel after wrestling in the dark with the divine. From him came the 12 tribes, the brutal slavery in Egypt, the miraculous exodus, the conquest, the kings, the exile, and the return. 2 sons, 2 massive historical trajectories. But where in this ancient family feud does the modern nation of Iran emerge? The Iranians are Persians, an Indo-European people, not Semitic, not biologically descended from the exiled Ishmael. The secret layer of this conflict lies in the tectonic shifts of empire and ideology. In ancient times, the Persians were actually the saviors of the Jewish people. It was Cyrus the Great of Persia who conquered Babylon and liberated the Jewish exiles, a pagan king so revered that the prophet Isaiah explicitly named him the Anointed of the Lord. For centuries, a complex but functional peace existed. The shift, the fatal historical pivot, occurred with the Islamic conquest of the Sassanid Persian Empire in the 7th century. As the Persians abandoned Zoroastrianism and embraced Islam, they absorbed the spiritual and ideological narrative of the Arab conquerors. They adopted the story of Ishmael. When the Iranian Revolution of 1979 swept the Ayatollahs into absolute power, this theological adoption became weaponized state policy. Iran transformed into a theocratic republic that positioned itself as the supreme defender of the Islamic world, adopting the Palestinian cause and the visceral opposition to the State of Israel as its defining geopolitical pillars. The conflict had transcended bloodlines. It was no longer strictly ethnic. It had become deeply, fiercely ideological. A nation that did not descend from Abraham took upon itself the ancient grievance of the exiled son, pointing its modern weaponry at the children of the promised son. It is easy to dismiss this as overly simplistic. Modern geopolitics is driven by uranium enrichment, proxy militias, oil dominance, and regional hegemony. The drones and ballistic missiles are manufactured in modern facilities, not desert tents. But beneath the surface of the uranium and the proxy wars of Hezbollah and Hamas, the ancient bedrock remains intact. When leaders in Tehran speak of erasing the Zionist entity from the map, and when leaders in Jerusalem speak of existential annihilation, they are tapping into a subterranean reservoir of memory. It is a narrative of belonging and exclusion, of the legitimate heir versus the displaced firstborn, of the barren princess and the proud servant. The ancient text records one final, haunting encounter between the two brothers. When Abraham breathed his last at the age of 175, Isaac and Ishmael stood side by side to bury him in the cave of Machpelah. The two men, separated by decades of resentment and an unfathomable divide of destiny, reunited over the corpse of the father who had loved them both. There is no record of a single word spoken between them. There was no reconciliation. There was no healing embrace. There was only the solemn duty of the grave, and then an eternal silence. The tragedy of this history does not lie in the presence of cartoonish villains. Sarah was not evil. She was a desperate, aging woman, terrified that a divine promise was slipping away. Hagar was not wicked. She was an enslaved girl who found fleeting pride in the only power she possessed. Abraham was not a monster. He was a flawed man trapped between two women, two sons, and the terrifying demands of God. Every single person in that dusty camp was simply trying to survive the crushing weight of their circumstances. They made small, fiercely human decisions, and those decisions fractured the world. 4,000 years of warfare, born not of malice, but of human impatience. Born of the arrogant belief that human hands must intervene to help God keep his word. The story that began with a promise to bless every family on the face of the earth resulted in a geopolitical fault line that threatens to tear the earth apart. The ancient dust of the desert has settled, but the descendants of that fractured family still look at each other across heavily fortified borders, their hands still against one another, still fulfilling the prophecy spoken to a weeping slave girl beside a desolate spring. If this story opens something in you, if you finally understand the ancient roots wrapped around our modern headlines, share it with someone who needs to encounter these heavy truths today. Every like and share carries this vital history further into a world that has forgotten how it began. Subscribe so you are there when we tell the next chapter. The ancient stories are far from over, and neither is God's work within them. Until next time.